I'm Debbie Gamble, Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Interac, and you're listening to Everyday Trust. We are witnessing a period of accelerated digitization in Canada. With this comes new opportunities and increased efficiencies. It also highlights one of the most important questions innovators face today. How can we give Canadians the confidence they need to participate fully in our emerging digital economy? The answer that I come back to over and over again is trust. Trust unifies our families, our communities, and even the way that we're governed. Trust can take years to build and a singular moment to break. And in a digital world, the way we build and maintain trust is constantly evolving, and we need to stay ahead of the curve. In this series from Interac, I'm talking to leaders about what trust means to them. As founder and CEO of the Future Today Institute, or FTI, Amy Webb and her team have pioneered a data-driven foresight methodology that's incredibly powerful. Every day, her and her team work with leaders around the world to try and make sense of the future, our digital future, and see what we need to do to navigate the quagmire of technology. In 2023, Amy was recognized as one of the most influential management thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She teaches strategic foresight at NYU Stern School of Management and was elected a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations and a member of the World Economic Forum. She's written 4 acclaimed books, which are amazing, on the future of technology. So I am beyond delighted that Amy took some time out of her crazy busy schedule to spend some time with us. So thank you very much. Round of applause for Amy. The first time I think we spoke was in 2019. And if I could characterize that conversation, it was a question of, is humanity doomed? So we talked about data protection, privacy, our rights. And I guess, given what you and the team have been working on, how do you think about where we're going? And how would you answer that question today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm your neighbor to the south in America, as you know. I think the problem with privacy and trust is that we tend to use our understanding, our fears, our concerns about privacy and trust in the present and just assume that the future will be like that, but worse, or that the future can be like that, but better. We don't often think about the future just being different than today. One of the examples that I think is interesting to contemplate is the coming advent of what I would call face computers. So Google, Apple, Snap, Meta, everybody is either working on or already has like a pair of smart glasses, but they're more than glasses because they're loaded with sensors. The Apple Vision Pro has like 14 cameras and accelerometers and gyroscopes and all different types of sensors, which is why I would call it a face computer, because it's a computer. So when you're wearing a device like that, your personal data are being mined and refined constantly in order to make the device work. However, there are some related issues to that. One of which is, what if you're a bystander in that image? And I think something we haven't really thought through yet is, we're going to have a bystander problem in the near future, as more people wear these devices. I may not want to be a part of whatever it is that you're doing right now. Now, it's hard enough today, especially at something like South by, everybody's constantly taking pictures. If you don't want to be in somebody's picture, it's a little hard to avoid that here because everybody's there's so much stuff. You can erase people from photos using the onboard technology on your Android phone or your iPhone. But just because you've personally taken them out doesn't mean that they're out of the data, the corpus that's used to train the models. So that's something to think about. The other thing to think about is, I think we are headed toward a future where smart glasses or these face computers are going to enable different types of pricing, different types of financial transactions. And I think that will probably lead to a new and worse digital divide. And the example that I gave during my talk, but I think is relatable because everybody understands this, is groceries. We may reach a point where groceries are they're just more expensive. They keep being more expensive. And if people, at some point, the price point of these computers will come down so that everybody can afford them. So imagine a future that's more subsidized. You will get a coupon or a discount if you stand and stare, at a commercial, or you're willing to give up your data or something, right? You'll be able to tell if somebody is in the process of getting a discount because they're going to physically have to stand still for a few seconds, which means that privacy in the future, looks a little different. It means that by virtue of going into a grocery store, I will know right away who is affluent and who is financially struggling, because the affluent people will just move through the store on their own, and the people who are struggling will have to keep stopping over and over again to get the discounts they need to buy what they need to survive, right? So I think, again, as we're all contemplating the future of privacy and trust, we really do need to zoom out and contemplate the various ways that this might look different in the future.
Feels like an episode of Black Mirror, doesn't it?
So I hear that a lot. The question that I ask people always is, why do you think Black Mirror has been so effective in its storytelling? What do you think?
I'm not sure I'm the right audience to ask, because, I kind of revel in some of those scenarios because it actually is, it's playing out the scenarios.
Right. You're the wrong person, because you're like, oh, I understand what you're doing here.
Or let's play that a little further to see where that's going. But I love the show from both the kind of, wow, that's kind of crazy, to like, oh no.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but it resonates because it starts with something that's true and real. And it doesn't go out into some crazy science fiction, bizarro world. It presents us with a plausible near-term future, or even a plausible mid-term future. That's why that show is so resonant, and why the storytelling is so effective. If you think about how we process information about the future, that way of thinking about the future works really well when you're sitting and you've got some free time and you're watching a show. But when you're working in business, you shut that part of your brain off. And somehow you're not willing to allow your mind to think that way about the future. And now is a very good time to sort of practice that and to build that muscle, because it will help you start to identify potential problems before they arise, but also points of leverage so that you can create value going forward.
So I think, as you say, we're kind of desensitized, to the implications of our data being collected, being mined, being used. But at the same time, many of us are starting to really worry about this. And so I'm going to give you some stats from a recent survey we did at Interac. For any of you who don't know, I guess I should have said at the beginning, Interac's Canada's payment and verification network. I know there's a lot of Canadians in the house. Yay, Canada. Also, people from other parts of the world. So, and we're very proud at our company, which I'll touch on in a bit. But we do a bunch of surveys. So here's some stats around, the concerns. So in a recent survey that we did, 8 in 10 Canadians feel their personal data is more exposed than ever. 72% are concerned that companies have access to too much of their personal information. And 8 in 10 want greater control of their online information. Many of us, however, don't really take that ownership and accountability piece that I'm sure we'll get into. So should we be worried?
Actually, I find it heartening that people are concerned, because I think if you had asked a lot of those same questions even a year or two ago, you might have gotten different answers. So I think it's good that people are aware that their data are not necessarily secure or even their own. I think the next step is to start asking questions that would resolve that concern. What will it take for me to have more control, for me to feel like companies are a little bit less intrusive going forward?
When you think about that accountability, we're going to get, certainly in our industry of financial services and verification, the notion of liability is a huge issue. But most of us, kind of don't really pay too much attention to that. So, I kind of see that there's going to be a real shift in and there's a need for education, obviously, but a real shift in that notion of what each of us are responsible for. And you touched, one of the other themes was accountability and obligation.
Yeah. I think one of the consistencies that we've seen is that the big tech companies keep somehow escaping liability every time something goes wrong. We hear over and over again, we're just the platform. We're just the provider. We're just the cloud. And to some degree, I guess that makes sense. However, we are moving into a situation where without an accountability chain, we're just not going to fix the problems that we're going to face in the future. What's interesting to me is that there's a reason why companies are not accountable, and it's because the market doesn't reward it. There's no market incentive to prioritize safety and trust in advance so that nothing happens, right? And if anything, a lot of companies that do that and spend money on it are not rewarded because it's seen as a waste of money. So I think we might need to reconsider our incentive structures so that we do incentivize accountability.
So, as we explore this idea, I think there's a few things that come to mind. As you were talking, I was thinking about another talk that I'd done previously called The Currency of Trust. And I think what I'm thinking about is not just people participating in the incentives, but also that liability structure being changed so that there is an incentive through trust, right? Because we know that that's a key component regardless of where we're going. We'll probably talk about verification in a minute, but
we may not. We may never get there.
Right.
We can try.
But and then the other person I was thinking about is I spoke to an entrepreneur called Vivek Wadhwa a couple of years ago, and he kind of blew my mind with the notion of cancer being a data problem. And so it took me a while to kind of, like many people, cancer's touched my family. It's a very emotional topic. It impacts everybody, every family around the world. So what if we could solve it through that kind of approach, right? Yeah. So I think when you talk about kind of DNA banks and, people start to freak out, but you strip the PII data, much as we do in payments, right? So at Interac, we strip that data, right, so that people can transact easily. We take the friction out of the experience, but it's safe and secure and tokenized, and the personal data is not available in the clear.
Right. We're always asking the question, what does value creation look like in the future? And obviously, trust and accountability is a huge piece of that. But it strikes me that there are so many other ways to create value that can still be commercialized or monetized. So, it creates tangible value versus, I guess, ephemeral or theoretical value, but you're still going to need a broker. And it would be kind of interesting, you say the words data broker today, and that's, those are the bad guys. I hope none of you are in the room, but you're very bad people, data brokers. It. But it would be interesting to reclaim that, right? Because really what we're talking about is using data in these different ways to create value going forward, to create tangible value. You just need a trusted intermediary, which is literally what Interac is, which means that I don't mean to do your strategy for you going forward,
no,
but I could see genomic data. I could see all of these connected devices that are coming to market. They all create and produce data. We were messing around with pretty soon, all of the appliances in a home are going to be connected in some way. And it's because of product cycles and just how companies continue to make money. They either need you to keep buying new devices or they need to sell you services, which means that everything in the house will have an IPv6 connection. So there's a way to pool all the unused compute of all those devices and then harness that and sell it back.
And then stick it on the blockchain. And
Well, I mean, yes. And then the end result of that is it's another pooled asset that you could divide up. And on the back end, maybe people are getting a few cents per minute or something. And so they're not going to earn a windfall of millions of dollars, but maybe it's enough to offset a mortgage, or maybe it's enough to offset utility bills. Housing is tough in Toronto, right? It's like really, really hard. Okay, so maybe this helps create affordable housing. But you're going to need a trusted intermediary. So the thing that I keep coming back to is, what are all the ways that value gets created? And, how can, and also, by the way, this is what props up the GDP of any country, which is going to have a problem going forward. Everybody's countries are going to have some problems going forward. So this is just a clever way of getting ahead of things, I think.
Woven into that theme is participation and inclusivity and equity at some point, right? And a proposition that's equitable, not just for the few, to help address the digital divide. One of the, massive topic of last year and this year for everybody is AI. And many of us, certainly in the financial services industry, we've been using large language models for years to look at fraud. And we're grappling, getting our head around how we address the notion of when everything is connected and everything is digital, bad actors, vectors of attack increase. So when you're thinking about AI from that context, not necessarily fraud, but, the good and the bad, how should we be thinking about that? How should we be approaching, maybe let's think about fraud in our industry.
Yeah. So did you hear about the thing that happened in Hong Kong like 3 days ago?
No.
So there was somebody who works, I believe, in financial services who believes they were at a remote, so work from home, logged into whatever it was, Teams or Zoom or whatever they were using, believed that their executives, like their C staff, were in a meeting. They're all talking to each other. So it felt very much like any other remote meeting where you've got some people at work, in the office, and some people at home. And at some point at the end of this meeting was something about, we need to move some money around, and there was $25 million. And I think this was the CFO maybe, or a comptroller type of person, who then processed that transaction. That entire meeting was deep faked. And so take a look at this later. So that is something that I bring up because I think, as powerful as a lot of this technology seems today, it will continue to evolve. What comes after large language models are large action models. What comes after deep faked, short videos or photos or voices are deep faked events. So we have to sort of stay vigilant and anticipate the ways in which things might change. And we haven't even talked about spatial computing and movement identity and malware that happens after you get somebody to move their hand or to walk into a space or something like that. So again, this comes back to what I said earlier. When you're thinking about the future, you have to break free of your typical patterns. It's not today, but worse. It's very likely today, but also totally different.
That's where the scenario mapping comes in, right? Do you want to share a little bit about strategic foresight?
Sure. So I started my company 20 years ago. We're called Future Today Institute. And we work in one tiny area of strategy, but an area that I think is very important called strategic foresight. Now, 20 years, maybe 30 years ago, corporate strategy was strategic foresight, which is a way of saying there was the strategy and execution piece, which are very important, but also the scenario mapping and the data modeling and the vision and the long-term planning and execution. Somewhere along the way, things became very specialized. Corporate strategy really became about very short cycles. a year, 2 years, 3 years at max. And the foresight piece kind of got spun off into like trends, or to some cases like, just scenarios or just workshops or whatever. The two really are part of the same discipline.
Yeah.
And strategic foresight shows you, where do you play? How do you win? And what's it going to take to make you resilient going forward? But it all is very much rooted in data and modeling.
So full transparency, we did some work at Interac around, what we needed to think about. And one of the key themes for us in the role that we play in the ecosystem, and that the work that we've been doing is on verification. Some people may call it ID and authentication, but we've been very focused on what we can do to help Canadians, consumers and businesses, think about the security of their engagement, whether, they're talking to a human or a bot, or and the counterparty confidence. So, we really see that is a key component for financial services industry, but pretty much every sector of the marketplace. And the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada, or DIAC, quantified that the value of doing that well can add something like $15 billion to the economy. That's Canada's economy, right? So pretty significant to us. So when you and your team look at what's going on in the marketplace, how do you look at verification? Does that play into your work?
Oh, it absolutely does. If we wind up in a situation where we have scarcity, let's say food scarcity in any way, or certain types of food, I think there's going to be an egg shortage. I'm trying to remember where I heard something about chickens and eggs. And, so if we wind up with shortages, either because of supply chain problems, or there's a conflict in one part of the world that means shipping containers can't get to a different part of the world, we may wind up in a situation where market demand is very high, and there are bad actors willing to counterfeit in order to help meet that demand. I've actually lived through that a few times. I used to live in China, and I also used to live in Japan, and there were a few instances where there were some counterfeit food products being passed off, and they wound up being pretty harmful. So this is where verification comes into play. Provenance. Can I verify not just this is where this product was manufactured, but I can trace where all of the ingredients came from? I don't mean to say that we're going to wind up in this trustless situation where everybody's skeptical of everybody and everything all the time. There are incentives in place, oftentimes to mislead folks. And this is a big year, especially for misinformation, because there's 70 elections coming up. Half the population on the planet will vote for something this year. So again, there are lots of points of vulnerability, and there are incentives, which means that verification is going to be mission critical. And I know that's something that you guys have been thinking about and really working on for years.
Yeah, we have. And, lots of people in our ecosystem have as well. But we really see it as a necessity for a vibrant digital economy. Actually the payment space, the history of the payment space has been based on the evolution of digital trust in one way, shape or other. But we think that it's actually bleeding into everything, which is kind of where you're going. You said something wonderful yesterday, that was the need for us to fight for our future. And the goal of digital prosperity, which is something I think a lot about. And I'm sure I bore my team to death with connecting the dots between what we're doing to digital prosperity, because Interac is a very purpose-driven organization. So you touched on, certainly some of the challenges that we can see in scarcity, in the digital divide. Talk to us a little bit about that, kind of looking at the future and how that's connected to our prosperity.
So one of the things that we found in our research is that we think starting Q3 last year, we entered what we would call a new technology supercycle. So in economics, I'm sure all of you know this. A supercycle is a sustained and structural change in an economy that can take place over years or decades. And the result afterwards is a pretty sizable change in in society. So the steam engine kicked off the Industrial Revolution. That was a super cycle that obviously changed economics, society, everything else going after that. The internet kicked off the internet boom, right? Same deal. We actually have 3 core areas of technologies. They're categorized as general purpose technologies that are all converging and have been for a few years, that are sort of creating this flywheel that are what sort of create this technology supercycle, because this time around, it's not one technology, but 3. So that's artificial intelligence, this connected ecosystem of things, connectable things. So that's wearable devices, your home of things, Internet of Things, connected office, all that stuff. And then biotechnology. This technology supercycle will create winners and losers. It has the potential to positively shape a country's GDP and to, again, help net value creation, and lots of people can win. But for countries that aren't preparing or are preparing for the wrong type of future, this could really threaten the economy and the future prosperity of those people. There are lots of countries around the world with established industry sectors that are really 20th century technology, cars, heavy manufacturing, right? Things like that. Those industries are going to get hit. And also in those countries, they're still prioritizing a traditional 4-year college education, which means that they're going to have scarcity in jobs that already exist today. We don't have enough plumbers and electricians and things. It also means they're not going to be able to move the population into the next phase of what work should look like. So I think prosperity is possible. Digital prosperity is possible, but it's not going to happen without planning. And every country, every company right now needs to do meaningful, data-driven, long-term planning and tie that back to strategy and execution.
Can we talk about Canada for a minute?
Yeah.
So there's a sense in Canada that perhaps we're falling behind and trailing other countries like Australia, the UK, Brazil, India, in the payments innovation space. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is expecting Canada to come in last amongst the advanced countries in terms of per capita GDP growth between 2020 and 2030. So what's your sense of where Canada sits and how we look at the future?
I would be curious to know what is Canada's vision of the future for itself. So, if you go to a lot of countries around the world right now and their leaders, for better or worse, and sometimes it's worse, there is a clear vision of what that future is going to look like. And some of the countries that you just rattled off that list have that vision, very strongly in view. I'll go to Brazil for a moment. Bolsonaro, who is no longer in office, had a very clear vision of what he wanted the future to look like. And he was headed straight there. And now Lula, who's politically opposite,
right,
also has a very strong vision of the future. They're polar opposites. And there's been a little bit of whiplash among the business community in Brazil. But there is a certain sense of urgency as a result. I look at Canada as being very stable. It's no surprise to me that everybody trusts you. My question is, what's the sense of urgency in Canada? And is there a sense that, we have a clear idea of what our value proposition as a nation is? We have a clear understanding of which industries we're going to try to propel. We know how we want to create new value. We know what we want our future population to be like, to how they're going to work, how they're going to contribute, and we're all going to sort of move in that direction together. I feel like I pay a lot of attention to Canada, and if you ask me right now, what is that plan, or like pick one thing that we're like, you could tell that we're really working on, I can't give you an answer. And I think that's an opportunity. I wouldn't see that as a deficiency. I think it's an opportunity to do that planning.
Well, I think when you think about certainly my space, our space at Interac in the financial services industry, we've got a lot going for us. You know, the Canadian ethos around inclusivity. We've got a very stable and risk-adverse financial services industry, which works very well in turbulent times. What we're grappling with is how we embrace the future together as an industry to broaden access, broaden competitiveness, and allow Canadians to really embrace a digital future. But I think, you know, if you were to ask me, I would say I am optimistic, but it means we've got to work together. And there's lots of people in the room here that are actively focused on doing that, whether it be in the public sector, in the private sector, financial institutions, industry partners. So I personally think we need to get our act together, but, you know, assuming we can do that, we can leapfrog.
I totally agree because the other sort of nice thing about Canada, you don't have some of the ego problems that your neighbors to the south do. Let's put it that way. And I think that's an advantage. I'll go back to this crazy idea about the genome-backed security, which I know that's like insane and whatever else. But, you know, it would be really interesting if like the financial sector in Canada was like, look, the one thing we've got going for us is that we are risk averse. We are very trustworthy.
Right.
So let's
and we're digital savvy, right?
Absolutely.
We're a digitally savvy nation.
Absolutely. So and we have a very diverse population.
Yes, we do.
So let's continue along that pathway and now create a tiny little just a joined thing over here where we're going to start incubating some of these other ways that value, like a universal value exchange. Value might be created in exchange. Doesn't mean we're going to stop doing all the stuff that's really important here. We're just going to start meaningfully testing out some of these other things to see if we can create a constellation of inclusive financial growth. If anybody could do something like that, I actually think it could be you.
Well, it certainly feels like, you know, aligned with the Canadian psyche.
Yep.
And I love the idea of, you know, collective value growth. But what advice would you give the leaders in the room around how they grapple with how they and their companies face the future?
Now is the time for strategic risk taking. And I know it. So sometimes when I say this to leaders, they're like, we got that covered. We're taking risks all the time. And you're not. You're not. So, you know, real strategic risk taking would be doing meaningful modeling. Not you as the leaders, you delegate, but like do some modeling, figure out in a quantitative way what is the momentum, what is the trajectory, how do we see things moving, and come up with a mechanism for prioritization. I'm just like, you need a system that allows you to take meaningful strategic risks. They don't have to be enormous. But what I see happening right now is a lot of CEOs sort of firmly entrenching themselves in only the things that they know that work, right? And then maybe they're going to iterate a teeny tiny bit outside of that. You know, and the annual planning cycle really becomes like this update cycle. You know, so we've got our big plan. Now it's been a year. We did a lot of these things. Let's do them a little bit more next year. Right. Now is the time for bold thinking and setting that vision for 10 years from now or 7 years from now or whatever it is, and trying to get that vision right, but being very flexible on the path to get there. And that brings me back to sort of, you know, and look, America we've got our heads up our asses. We don't know either. You know, it's a challenging operating environment for everybody. There's so much policy uncertainty in the United States. I know you guys know nothing about this, but like, there's so much policy uncertainty that it's really hard to be a business leader right now. So you can't wait for politics. There's a ton of uncertainty. So model what you can know, figure out what you can't by modeling those uncertainties, and then say, this is where we're placing our bet. This is the thing that we're going to become great at, and we're going to sort of work backwards to get there. And we're going to find partners. We're going to build coalitions. We're going to not go it alone because it's a terrible idea. And we're going to keep taking in new information as it comes. And that's how we're going to get to the future. And that I really think is the right way forward. And I know to many people, it feels like this is what they're doing, but I like never see that in practice.
It sounds like you just described the Canadian ecosystem, to be honest, right? Something that is a collaborative approach, something that we can kind of work on together that is equitable and sustainable. I think they are, that's a great objective for us to work together on and to build that future together. So I want to thank you for spending a bit of time with us in your crazy schedule. And we look forward to doing this again. Hopefully, come to Toronto. Yeah. We'll come here. We'll come and see you somewhere else. But thank you. Everyone, if you can give Amy a great round of applause. In the technology supercycle we find ourselves in today, there will be winners and losers. But how can business leaders best prepare themselves to navigate the challenges of the digital era and avoid being on the wrong side of history? As Amy Webb reminded us, the future is often closer than we'd like to imagine. There's a reason why sci-fi shows are so compelling. They tap into a not-so-distant future that's rife with some of the very realistic problems we might encounter as technology continues to evolve. The best way business leaders can prepare for the future is to predict it. And while none of us are privy to a crystal ball, it's important to anticipate what changes may be afoot and challenge ourselves to break free of typical patterns. According to Amy, now is not the time to stick to tried and true strategies. Instead, leaders need to be taking bold yet strategic risks and think big for the future. In a world of uncertainty, Amy's advice is to model your vision for the future based on what you know now, while remaining flexible in your approach, leveraging scenario mapping, and adapting to new information as it comes. And remember, we're all in this together. It's up to all of us to forge a path ahead for a better future. Thank you for listening to Everyday Trust. If you found this conversation valuable, please take a moment to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.